This is Lecture 123D, Building Socialism Part 4. Now, to recap 1928 Central Committee meetings, the January 1928 meeting had confronted the complete collapse of the China policy the previous April 1927, and the failure to complete the infrastructure preparation to implant all of the acquired foreign technology and even domestically produced machinery, and finally the scissors crisis in agriculture. An April 1928 meeting had addressed what Stalin called important questions in a unified way for the first time in several years, thanks to the liquidation of the opposition. The party now continued in a responsible and unanimous way, these important questions being the Shakti affair and the crisis in agriculture. Now, the July 1928 meeting had focused on the internal danger from inherently anti-communist bourgeois industrial specialists in alliance with foreign capitalists, and the need to press for collectivization in agriculture, and finally the need to step up the preparation of a new classless intelligentsia of technocrats. At the end of November 1928, the Central Committee surgically approached the problem of modernizing the Red Army, and the industry needed to support it. And those of you interested in the blow-by-blow fighting between all of the interested parties are referred to Stone's Hammer and Rifle, pages 86 to 107. The bottom line, as Stone says in his concluding paragraphs to these essays at the end of his Chapter 4 on modernization, made the Red Army better able to fight the USSR's next war. But what Voroshilov, Ushalik, Shaposhnikov, and Tukhachevsky and their fellow officers required was industrialization to enable the Soviet economy to produce the accoutrements of modern war and the budget to buy them. Their convictions, increasingly shared by Stalin and the Politburo, grew over 1927 and 1928 to give added emphasis to Vasenka's, the NEC's, and Gosplan's race to draw up increasingly ambitious industrialization plans. The first 5-year plan, informed by the military's growing demands for modern equipment and drawn up in an atmosphere permeated by fear of foreign saboteurs, would finally turn the corner to rearming the Soviet military." Unquote. When we speak about revolution, it is usually because we're speaking about workers, farmers, and other oppressed strata against the ruling oligarchy of capitalists and their allied classes. In other words, we are speaking about the classical revolution from below. Now we are speaking about revolution directed from above, the revolution that we have come to know as the Great Turn. This was the second Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. In 1928, in the Soviet Union, the workers were at the top of society, allied with other classes and strata, especially the farmers. At the head of the workers was the Revolutionary Bolshevik Party, with the Soviet government at the local, county, republic, and federal level. And we are speaking about the state in its hands, that is the Army, Navy, and federal and republic level police, uniformed and secret. The revolution could continue from above rather than from below, because Stalin's revolution came from the workers' government. It was a new type and justifiable type because this government was led by the Workers' Vanguard Party. That party had both its government and state power in its hands. The government was based on the alliance of the proletariat in a bond with the farming masses. The Great Turn in the USSR featured 1. A radical shift in the agrarian basis of the nation, and 2. The priorities of the working class in the industrial centers of the nation. Now, we cannot disapprove of revolution from above as long as we understand that this continuation of the October Revolution was perfectly correct given the new historical conditions where the working class led society. This great turn in domestic orientation replaced NEP, the new economic policy, and practically manifested itself in the policies of the higher instruments of party policy and the party's absolute control of state power, that is, the military and the Cheka. The key to the resolution of 2 of these problems we have discussed, and these are detailed in the initial chapters of David R. Stone's book, Hammer and Rifle, The Militarization of the Soviet Union, 1926 to 1933. The resolution was possible because the government had acquired new sources of revenue. The collectivization of agriculture provided the party and its government with those resources. The priorities of the working class in the industrial centers old and new, would favor the Red Army. Why? Because the prime task of the Bolshevik Party was to retain state power. This meant getting ready for the next and inevitable round of war with the surrounding imperialist states. And we shall now review the two threads of the Great Plan. First, the 5-year plan. Throughout 1928, Stalin adjusted the pace of events in its agriculture, trying to decide how to maximize the speed of the collectivization once the first 5-year plan officially got underway in August. He found that rapidly expanding its scope, that is geographical broadness, as well as its depth, that is the actual collection of tools, animals, and other farm equipment and livestock, had overall given the best results. In other words, seizing everything everywhere worked best. What also became apparent was the inability of the agricultural capitalists and their sympathizers to keep pace with the government's increasing demands, nor could they keep up with the party's use of agitators to whip up the poor middle farmers and the employment of armed troops, uniformed chicas, supported when and where necessary by the Red Army, to see these decisions carried out with maximum speed and thoroughness. Now the kulaks lost out altogether immediately and were deported to virgin lands in Siberia or Soviet Central Asia to begin again as common farmers. Exiled for 5 years, they could eventually return, but were forever banned because of class background from participating in the collective farms or farming cooperatives. Thus, after starting over again as common farmers for 5 years, they could eventually confront the need to find other kinds of employment in the cities. Consequently, most of the adult deportees did not return, but of their children, most would. Now, this would be a problem for the Soviet government, and it had only been set over for 5 years. The party and the government would eventually have to deal with these vacillating offspring. The industrial half of the Stalinist solution moved along much more smoothly than did the situation in the countryside. The reason for this was the Bolsheviks' complete control of the labor movement in the cities, and their decade of experience in organizing the national economy and securing it international partners in development, not to mention the huge amount of industrial espionage underway for many years. Now, all of this had been under the direct supervision of the boss. The agricultural half of this revolution was more difficult, yet it was accomplished. And two, the great struggle, collectivization and industrialization, no retreat, no surrender. The idea of collectivizing agriculture in these small-holding farmer kinds of countries goes back to Karl Marx. Lenin had also written about it from a theoretical standpoint. The idea of massive industrialization was feasible if one had the money. It was having the money which had been the central contradiction of the post-Lenin government, a problem aided and abetted by the bourgeois specialists versus the old Bolsheviks' contradiction. Would this be the end of the story? No. Bolsheviks don't give up, Bolsheviks don't surrender, and don't retreat for long. As we have seen, Stalin had been forced into a corner by history. By 1928, he had finally decided what to do, namely to both collectivize agriculture and industrialize the nation simultaneously. However, he was not the sole leader. He had to work carefully to maintain his plurality in the political bureau, the Central Committee, and in the party congresses and conferences. And that is exactly what he had been doing. Now, Stalin proved to be an excellent politician, and he kept his markers out. The first 5-year plan was his answer for industrialization. He had found the solution for financing of the Red Army and the equally important national industrialization to the most modern levels. That solution would be to take all of the nation's agricultural produce into the Soviet government's coffers. That, along with the wealth already coming from timber, oil, minerals, diamonds, furs, caviar, and other exotic products, would provide all the needed money. Now the Bolsheviks could finish building the capitalist technological infrastructure and basic modern industry they should have inherited. Soviet farmers proudly raised their heads from an embarrassing dead weight to a great national asset. In other words, to pay the cost of industrialization, Stalin needed a lot of money. Collectivization gave him that money, and collectivization gave the farmers a national social self-respect they had only previously enjoyed in Socialist Revolutionary Party and Bolshevik Party propaganda. Mechanically, the party got much of the agricultural wealth internally. First, from the turnover tax. That was a kind of sales tax at the point of origin of all sales, that is, collections on the collective farm grain produced. At this point, the government took what it was due and paid the collective farm for the difference at the wholesale price the government set. And additionally, two, by determining the price of bread per loaf to individual consumers according to a predetermined retail rate. This plan introduced a de facto new market mechanism with socialist characteristics. In summary, the party had turned agricultural produce of wheat, oats, rye, barley, sorghum, rice, potatoes, and sugar beets into a multiple revenue stream asset. This new market mechanism effectively incorporated about 60 to 90% of the farmer's wealth and the average industrial worker's income, harnessing it to national development. The party, through its government, determined the wholesale price per ton paid to the collective farms and determined the retail price per loaf that workers had to pay for their daily bread. In this way, the overwhelming agricultural product of the nation was transferred in ownership from the petty capitalist small farmers into the national treasury, and simultaneously the secondary sale to the consumer, i.e. the party-determined retail price, was turned into another profit center for the government. 90% of the Imperial Russian population had been an absolute dead weight on the nation's growth. The Bolsheviks in the USSR had transformed them into Soviet communism's greatest growth asset. Soviet agricultural people were now true farmers. They had been transformed from being an embarrassingly primitive ball and chain into proud, independent, upstanding men and women. Peasants had become proud farmers with a critical role to play in the growth of the revolutionary nation. Conversely, in the USA, ruled by the super-rich handful of millionaire and billionaire families, non-corporate farmers were considered poor white trash. There they played the role of an ignorant and foolish lowest form of life, a form subjected to every form of inhumanity and indignity that capitalism had allotted the mass of farmers, as, for example, the role assigned to African Americans and their competing poor white trash in the most backward Yankee states. It was even worse for the European colonies, as well as the Latin Americans under the jackboot of gringo imperialism, who suffered under the same incredibly cruel regime imposed on the Americas. To compare and contrast, the increasingly educated masses of the world, as well as in the Soviet Union, began to see a real new world order was indeed possible. It was worth fighting and dying for. The dialectical converse was that the world's ruling classes saw that they had to attack and destroy this Soviet example, precisely because their system was now exposed and bankrupt. It is for this same reason that the gringo oligarchs persist in their anti-Cuba embargo policy today, using the Miami Mafia of Diaz Balarts and Ross Littonens as the Goebbels and Goerings of gringo fascism. July 1928. NEP will not suffice. Stalin informs the Central Committee that the time is at hand. In 1927, the economic crisis had been deepening, and not just because of the kulaks or the inherent problems we have just reviewed. As the spring of 1928 concluded, and the news from China had had a full year to sink into the minds of the Politburo, Stalin called an emergency full meeting, a plenary session, of the entire Central Committee to hear what he had to say about the crisis in industrialization. Stalin spoke from the stage at his Kremlin theater to a large body of the most loyal and dedicated members of the Communist Party, with a series of charts, enlarged and lighted behind him. Stalin explained to his colleagues the details of the current crisis and what he intended to do about it. Stalin handled the entire meeting personally, and something rare for him, never stopped talking, cajoling, persuading, browbeating, until he got everyone into line. This is what Lenin had done in the most important party congresses, for example, the 1907 Party Fifth Congress in London, where Stalin had been present and had learned well from his mentor. The substance of the internal crisis in agriculture we reviewed in Volume 1 by reproducing Stalin's critical presentation in his own words. As the July Central Committee meeting concluded, Stalin summed it up. By mid-1928, the crisis was deepening to the greatest extent because of success. That is, the Chica's Economic Directorate priority, to which so much funding had been allocated, had paid off, and all the targeted equipment was on hand. However, the necessary infrastructure to support all the new incoming factories and equipment simply was not being finished on time. Consequently, machinery was piling up everywhere in the Soviet Union, waiting for the infrastructural basics. Now we're going to have a quick inside snapshot of the July 1928 Central Committee meeting. Stalin says, "Comrades, far worse for us at the moment than anything happening in China is the fact that we have hundreds of millions of dollars worth of brand new machinery sitting under tarpaulins in the rain, and soon it will be snow and ice. If we do not get that equipment installed now, quickly, we may lose a great deal of it. The only way to make this stuff impregnable to weathering is to get it working. I'm going to have to replace the shock teams I have been using so far to meet each of these bottlenecks with a mass movement of the Soviet population into preparation of the infrastructure, because we have to have the basics now. By which I mean the foundations of these steel plants behind the Urals will have to be implanted with blast furnaces and steel pouring equipment, and steel being produced even before the walls and roofs are finished. We have to get the dams finished that supply the power we need at Magnetic Mountain, Magnitogorsk. We must have this hydroelectric power, and the dams at least partially functioning, if we are to get our aluminum manufacturing equipment installed and producing before it too goes to rust. Those infrastructure basics have to be ready to receive that power, even if they have no foundations, walls, or roofs. Regardless of sacrifice, our aluminum plants will be ready to receive power. At Gorky, that is Nizhny Novgorod, we need steel assembly roofing plants constructed now. If we hope to get our truck industry producing with all the new American components and manufacturing equipment right now, and if we hope to have the main plant completed before next year. Even then, none of those automobile plant buildings will have walls in their first 9 months. Now the list goes on, but what it means is we need millions of workers sent to new infrastructure tasks. There can be no fucking around here, comrades. Either we industrialize regardless of the cost, or we are defeated. We have perhaps 10 years to get ready. Either we do it, or they crush us. My plan to solve this crisis is in what Gosplan and I am calling, and as many of you know, our first 5-year plan. Under its auspices, we can work with the draft of all able-bodied, unemployed men and women to go to the production fronts, such as those just mentioned, and they can be paid as we can afford to pay them. Meaning, specifically in terms of wages, we can feed them and their families. As we can, we will distribute cash to them as well. In terms of hours and working conditions, it will be up to the party cadre to convince workers of the importance to their own well-being and their own government and state to make new agriculture work and to make the industrial implantation work. These steps of the coming first plan will mean the end of unemployment in the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, that will still not be enough labor power. We need 10 million industrial shock workers today. We will get them within a year, but they will have to come from agriculture. We will need 30 million of these infrastructure workers by the 3rd year of the plan. Once collectivization gets underway, we will have them. Comrade Stalin, to get 10 million workers from agriculture will require a complete restructuring of agriculture, will it not? Yes, by the next fiscal year, and this begins in 3 months, so I need you to authorize these steps now. There were more questions and more answers for the better part of that day. The Politburo and the entire Central Committee listened to what the chief had to say. They had read all the briefing papers and appendices prior to the meeting as provided by Stalin's top bureaucrat and fellow Politburo member Vyacheslav Molotov, and finally they voted unanimous approval. What else could one do? What choice did Bolshevism have in the real world of hostile capitalist encirclement? The fist again. By 1926, a new class of rich farmers had clearly emerged. In only 5 years, a new agrarian ruling class had arisen. These were called kulaks, after the rich farmers of the Tsarist period, who had acted as the gendarmes of the Tsar's dictatorship in the countryside, and thus were referred to as the fists of the regime. The new rich farmers were assigned their old name kulak, which is the Russian word for fist. Below them in wealth were the middle farmers, who were a very large percentage of the farming population, and finally the poor farmers and the agricultural laborers. The commanding heights of village and countryside production were dominated once again by these new rich farmers. They could and did determine black market prices by storing, withholding, and selling as market conditions dictated. The largest and most significant percentage of total village or area grain and meat output. In 1926, these kulaks began to flex their newly created muscles. They were indicating a readiness to challenge the central government in Moscow over prices and delivery. They wanted better prices than the government was offering, or they would not sell. The government continued to opt, as it always would, indeed must, choosing guns over butter. The fist meets the chica, first versus second economy. Furthermore, all of the farmers wanted things to buy. However, goods from the cities were simply not getting to the villages, or were coming in such small drips and drabs that nothing other than the idiosyncratic private market, i.e. the often illegal, always present second economy, could be created for them. They wanted the foreign market opened up for selling and buying whatever they wished to sell, and for buying whatever they wished to import. That Bolshevism could not do. Putting the international law of value of the capitalist world order back to work in the Soviet Union would have destroyed the government's rationing and price control system, especially the way in which it bought and sold agricultural produce. It probably would undo the socialist accomplishments everywhere else as well, including in industrial production. What little capital the government had for industrial investment had to go to heavy and medium industry to support the fledgling agricultural machinery market, the automobile and truck transportation needs of the nation, and the overwhelming needs of the military. The latter meant little official consumer industrial production occurred, and even less of what was officially produced got beyond the urban market. The contradiction had to be frozen by employing state power, which is the reason for socialist state power to begin with, because the contradiction arises and an extension of the battle against the exploiters. In other words, this inability of the legal economy, that is the first economy, to provide homegrown industrial products to the countryside in sufficient amounts was the Achilles heel in the Bolshevik agricultural NEP. The kulaks were taking advantage and would continue to exploit this weakness to gain their objective. That overriding objective was not to get a Coleman lantern type of Primus, stove or burner, from Leningrad. Rather, they wanted to set the market price for their goods wherever they liked, and then to get that price paid by whomever, and including and especially the government. The kulak-dominated first and second agricultural economies gave the kulaks the ability to strangle the Bolsheviks eventually, if not immediately. These rich farmers were not responsive at all to the party's call for patriotic support of the effort to industrialize the nation, by which the party leadership meant larger voluntary contributions from the farmers' stores of grain, so the government could continue to be able to buy all the factories and equipment it needed to carry out its industrialization program. To tame the second economy, one had to break the class back of its existence and completely reformulate the first economy. This meant eliminating the capitalist class in the countryside altogether and putting the landless agricultural workers and poor farmers in command of an alliance with those among the middle farmers who would support them. To do this, the fist would have to meet the chica in open combat. On August 1st, 1928, collectivization of the forced nature really got underway. Collectivization began over the entire broad expanse of the Soviet agricultural regions virtually at the same time. Although it would take nearly the entire 4 years and 3 months of the first 5-year plan to see 100% of the agricultural productive land area of the USSR completely collectivized. A broad spectrum of urban party volunteers, students, and young pioneers assisted the Cheka. Their task was to mobilize mass support in the villages, ensuring the poor farmers and landless agricultural workers a free hand in challenging the kulaks and those among the middle farmers who were their supporters. These reactionary elements were to be dispossessed of virtually all their property. Most would be deported for 5 years to Siberia to begin again as common farmers. That was the class of relatively rich farmers history had found guilty of virtually every crime against the masses. It would now answer to the highest court, that of historical revenge. So began the Second Proletarian Revolution in the Soviet Union. In 1926, the handwriting was on the wall, and something would have to be done quickly or the crisis would be upon us. This uncomfortable position of being cut up by the inability to produce sufficient amounts of consumer goods as one blade, having chosen in favor of long-term industrialization, and the demand of the kulak-led oppositionist farmers for higher prices for their grain, meat, and poultry as the other blade, was referred to by economists of that time as being in the scissors crisis. Not all farmers fell into the kulak-led trap, and most middle farmers vacillated. Poor farmers were pro-government, as were agricultural laborers. In 1926, as we have seen, Stalin was firmly in the leadership saddle, and had been for at least 5 years, and by 1926 he had decided that to industrialize Russia and mechanize and modernize its agriculture in an entirely new way, an historical task was required. The intensity that would be required to achieve success was clear to Stalin and Molotov, and the boss intended on melting the scissors by liquidating the tailors. By 1928, he gave them one last chance. As the harvest began to stand impressively in the fields, he made a special trip where he hoped to convince his opponents of the importance of conforming to the government's agricultural program. They refused, often insulting Bolshevism in the process. Anticipating an unreconstructed kulak capitalist-led peasantry, Stalin had begun his counter-moves in the latter half of 1927. These had been speeded up in 1928 before this final tour of the countryside in August. When it became apparent the kulaks were making a play for total power in agriculture, Stalin was ready to go for broke. Then he kicked off forced collectivization of the entire Soviet farming population. The party mobilized its volunteer plan, sending them to the countryside. Yet the main instrument of social policy would be the Cheka. Lenin's wisdom proved itself in the event, for without this, quote, sword and shield of the proletarian revolution, as he had named the Cheka, we would have failed in our agricultural policy. Up and until this time, the Soviet experience with forced collection of agricultural and animal husbandry products had been extensive but of mixed quality and results, most of it acquired during the Civil War. Since then, there had been only occasional need to resort to force to collect what the government was due. That is until the winter of 1927-1928, when Stalin backed emergency collection measures to counteract the kulak withholding of grain reserves, which we reviewed in Volume 1 in Stalin's own July words. Then, in the spring of 1928, the government was able to relax these forceful collections and allow the planning to proceed apace and the market economy to work unimpeded. The beginning of the great change came, as we have seen, after the fall harvest. In 1928, Stalin takes over agriculture. Again, the struggle began in August 1928. This time, the party would take the farmers in hand the way it had wanted to ever since the farmers had taken the party in hand and forced the restoration of a legal market agricultural first economy in 1921. This time, the party was prepared internally to pursue the task to the end. It had just the man at its head, Joseph Stalin, to see the mission would be accomplished no matter what the cost. This struggle to force the farmers into cooperatives and collectives was the greatest war the Bolsheviks ever had to fight until World War II. The middle peasants will snap to attention. The agricultural half of the Stalinist solution moved along on time or beat the schedule established in the end by the boss himself, who constantly pushed his planners to set higher production goals. The party began the wholesale use of volunteers along with Chekas to remove the rich farmers from the equation. As Molotov put it, and to paraphrase, the removal wholesale of the kulaks physically from the countryside forever will make the middle peasantry snap to attention, quote unquote. kulaks were specifically not allowed to participate in co-ops or collective farms because of their class backgrounds. As Stalin said, to paraphrase, quote, "These persons, as individuals, were perhaps guilty of little themselves, but they are from a class guilty of every crime against humanity imaginable, and will accordingly be required to pay the price," unquote. The price was often deportation. Trainloads after trainload of kulak families were deported for 5-year terms of exile to virgin areas of Siberia and Central Asia to begin again, this time as common farmers. Now, the regional bosses were the new disgruntled. However, while he was liquidating the power of the kulaks as a class, it was true that within the party that Stalin had lost support over the years of the first plan among his bureaucrats. Why? Because the societal contradictions created by the pace of the Stalinist solution were often enormous. As you may have surmised, these problems required a heavy government and state hand to see that they did not resolve incorrectly. Deportation. Just one example was deportation. Deportation disrupted social life throughout the agricultural regions. All of this dislocation interfered with the regional bosses' opportunities to meet their production schedules. One principal reason was that regional industrial bosses had always been able to rely on second economy privateers to marshal needed extra labor. They did this in the same way that capitalists in the USA can go to cheap labor providers for Mexican immigrant day laborers. These minor privateer capitalists were no longer in business because the labor they had had access to was now in the collective farms or deported. Thus, much of the second economy simply disappeared too. Production targets are high. And furthermore, the production targets for industry and collective farms were so high they often made compliance seemingly impossible for either workers or managers, yet the boss would not listen to his manager's pleas and increasingly found their protests to be indications of subversive counter-revolutionary sentiments, and accordingly they shut up. Why did Stalin's solution work? In the end, the Stalinist solution worked because, one, it gave the Russians something they absolutely had to have if they were to survive against the coming imperialist anti-communist war, that is, a modern industrial infrastructure. And it worked because, two, Soviet workers were willing to make the great sacrifices necessary to make the socialist dream a reality. It worked, three, because Soviet managers realized that their health, or lives, as well as their jobs and pensions, were on the line should they fail to do as they were told. Four, it worked because the remaining farming families all over the Soviet Union accepted the inevitable and got down to work as proletarianized agricultural workers with some private plots to cultivate in their spare time. And fifth, it worked because enthusiastic communist youth from the cities went to the countryside to agitate and propagandize in favor of the Great Turn. From 1929 to 1930, Stalin takes over industrial and military planning. In 1918, the Red Army Officer Corps had divided into Bolshevik officers and former Tsarist officers. From 1923 until 1928, the Soviet government likewise divided into Bolshevik bureaucrats and bourgeois specialist bureaucrats. Therefore, despite 5 major agencies working on planning, there was in the period 1923 to 1928, in effect, 5 years of no plan. The Red Army managed to win the war, and in the aftermath, the Bolsheviks won out over the Tsarist officers who died or were terminated. However, conditions did not permit such a peaceful transition in industry, and it took time to train the new generation of technocrats. By 1930, it became apparent to Stalin and his closest associates that they would have to take over the national planning themselves. Central to this takeover was the idea of a series of 5-year plans with goals to be accomplished in 5, 10, 15, and 20 years. So in 1930, we got the Molotov Government. In 1928, Stalin had stepped in as the party boss of his second revolution from above by taking command of the agricultural front and forced mass collectivization. In 1929, he began taking complete Politburo and Central Committee control of the industrial front, including the supporting infrastructure. In 1930, the implementation required a new government. In 1930, Vyacheslav Vlad Molotov replaced Alexei Rykov as prime minister. This change required Molotov to take the top spot as chair of the Defense Commission. Then, across the board for his new cabinet of commissars and agency chiefs, Molotov brought in trusted and experienced old Bolsheviks. Some continued their previous responsibilities, to which were added new ones. Sergo Orzanikis, often called the perfect Bolshevik, the Red Army general who had liberated Georgia, continued as chair of the NEC. Now he was given the new job as being commissar for heavy industry as well. Leonid Krasin, dead since November 1926, had had a top deputy, Alexander Sarupa, who took over international finance. Another Krasin protege, Gregory Grinko, stepped in to run the finance commissariat. Lenin's bank-robbing chief and longtime pre-October financial adjutant to Krasin, Maxim Litvinov, came in to take over foreign affairs. He would become the USSR's ambassador to the League of Nations. Nikolai Kubyshev was the new chief of the HQ RZSTO. Valerian Kubyshev took over as Gosplan boss. Clement Voroshilov continued as boss of the Red Army and Navy and as war commissar, Frunze having died in 1925. Molotov's title changed to Defense Commissar in 1934, and Voroshilov would continue at this job until replaced in 1940 by the old Bolshevik general Semyon Timoshenko, who was promoted to marshal in May 1940. And for more insight on all of this, I recommend Molotov's autobiography, Molotov Remembers. By the end of that fateful year of 1930, Molotov's boss, Joseph Stalin, found himself the boss of not just of the party, state, and government. He was also boss of what turned out to be the greatest and fastest industrialization of any country in the history of the world. Underlying all was a new recognition. Bolshevism's survival required the Great Turn. Bourgeois versus old Bolshevik specialists, contradiction resolved. The boss and his men had recognized that no matter how you cut it up, the pie of jobs available to the Soviet government was simply too small. You had to bake a much larger pie. In fact, many much larger pies. In economic terms, this was already underway. The double and quadruple output of basic industries like electric power, steel, coal, machine tools, construction, factory construction of heavy and light machinery, now underway, resolved the problem in a natural evolutionary way. In other words, these were fortunately undertakings already decided. Therefore, this solved the problem of insufficient bureaucratic jobs to go around. It would solve the problem of industrial inferiority vis-a-vis the capitalist countries who had our Soviet Union encircled. The Shakti case had speeded up the process. The decision had been made to replace the inherently treasonous class of bourgeois specialists as soon as possible. Now, what exactly did the party's new government have to do? Well, by 1929, it had become apparent that the bureaucratic warfare and Byzantine politics of the existing system of managerial control had proven unfit for the demands now being placed upon it. No matter how much intervention had occurred from the center since, say, 1926, the bureaucrats continued to hide equipment, raw materials, suborn subcontractors, and even marshal private second economy sources of labor power. Experience had proven that only the closest, hands-on, diligent supervision of the commanding heights of new industrial projects could ensure the success of the plan. For example, the foregoing mentioned Nizhny Novgorod automobile truck plant and the undertaking at Magnetic Mountain required the close top-level assurance that the goals and specifications of the 5-year plan were met. This meant that the boss himself and his best men had to take command, and some of these bottlenecks need to be described. First of all, at Gorky, or the old city of Nizhny Novgorod. How did one go about the actual construction of a tractor or automobile plant in a planned economy? Let us take one example of how the nightmare of learning how to do it turned out at the Nizhny Novgorod or Gorky automobile and truck plant. The first stage of plant construction cost the USSR $30 million cash paid up front to Henry Ford's company and called for 2 phases of construction to build it. First, an assembly plant in Russia with components now purchased from the U.S. to be operational in 1929. And secondly, a second phase where the Soviets would receive an entire manufacturing plant for A to Z building 130,000 automobiles and trucks by 1930, constructed under one overall authority, the All-Union Federal Automobile and Tractor Manufacturing Association, or VATO. Initially, it was to be implemented by 2 other agencies, Metallistroy and Avitstroy, overseen by the 2 main planning agencies, NEC or Vysenka and STO. This division of agency implementation and oversight constantly resulted in conflicts between the 2 subcontractors and their overseers, and the resulting mess having to go to the party's highest authorities for resolution. Always this required the intervention of the Politburo to resolve the problems. Even so, it would not be until the end of the second plan in 1937 before the projected 130,000 annual production rate was maintained on a regular basis. Real freedom of the press. We Bolsheviks believe, and believed then, in suppressing the capitalist press, now and forever. However, criticism from the party press over government activities, except during the war years, was always ongoing and intense. An excellent example can be seen by the way the press exposed the chaotic disgrace going on at the NN auto truck plant by the Soviet journal, English name for which is For Industrialization. Its correspondent in NN was Boris Agapov, and he wrote many of these articles over a 2-year period. In mid-January 1930, the magazine For Industrialization reported that all was not well at NN. VATO chiefs had been receiving glowing reports from NN since the project was announced a year earlier. In practice, the chiefs of Metallistroy and Avitstroy spent the first day of the January meeting screaming curses at each other, and it became apparent that little actual progress had been made at all. Only 10% of the needed amount of equipment and supplies was being received on a daily basis. Avitstroy had balked at paying the prices demanded by Metallistroy, that retaliated by putting an overload of demand from other concerns ahead of Avitstroy's orders. This mess was corrected right away, but the VATO bosses had to send special agents to handle the situation, and even then the infighting simply shifted to other theaters of the industrial front, while the main lesson learned by local managers turned out to be improvisation. In March of 1930, for example, confronting the planning failure of a 48 million brick shortfall, managers learned to get it another way, in that case by buying out the supply of a second economy silicate factory nearby. The alternative was to face the consequences, which by now could include mandatory death sentences for failure to meet quotas. In April 1930, Avitstroy complained it had insufficient locomotives and truck transport to move supplies from the delivery yard to the construction sites. Again, the center had to send adjusters to get things squared away. Agapov did not hesitate to give his opinion, which was to get Metallistroy out of the picture altogether and set up Avitstroy as the principal subcontractor for VATO at NN. Under its new Politburo assigned troubleshooters Sergo Orzanikits and Lazar Kaganovich, these 2 longtime Bolshevik leaders were sent to NN armed with the authority of the Central Committee Politburo and as the new chair and vice chair of the National Economic Council since September 10th of 1930. Orzanikins was simultaneously told to prepare to take over the now to-be-created Commissariat of Heavy Industry. The 2 finally got the mess under control at NN. However, it would not be until November of the following year, 1931, that the first batch of Ford Model A automobiles and Ford Model AA trucks began to roll off the production lines. In the meantime, there had been a host of serious problems not accounted for in the plan. In October 1930, for example, For Industrialization reported that the bureaucrats had failed to plan for the right amount of the right kind of alloyed steel. Neither Avitstroy nor Stahl, the steel supplier, had made plans to supply these needs, as they had hoped to import the steel they needed. Stahl had thus failed to even prepare the productive capacity for the right kind of steel. This meant unplanned expenses, time, and resources to make a special steel industry just to keep NN going on schedule. In retrospect, we can see clearly that the CCC Politburo intervention via Ordzhonikidze and Kaganovich saved the situation. They brought with them in their 10 September 1930 takeover at NN a large staff of trusted and able cadre that, one, mobilized the spirituality of the cause among workers, and two, tackled the specific mechanical bottlenecks. By the middle of 1933, Ordzhonikidze could report to Stalin that annual production had been overfilled by 30%, with auto and truck units rolling off the lines at a rate of 100,000 vehicles per year. Maintaining that rate was another matter, but at least these desperately needed cars and trucks were being produced at home and no longer had to be imported. This lesson was not lost on the CC Politburo and its chiefs in the new Stalin government headed by Vyacheslav Molotov. Now that brings us to the second example I want to use, which is Magnetic Mountain, or Magnitogorsk. Now Gorky, or NN, was a well-established czarist town in Bolshevik City. The party had a large and important apparatus on hand when the first plan leaders announced their choice of NN to be the center of the automobile truck industry. On the other hand, the party planners had also decided to build another show city in the wilderness out of nothing on hand whatsoever. Magnitogorsk would be a major city built largely in secret on the eastern side of the extreme southwest Urals Mountains on the Ural River in the Chelyabinsk Oblast of the RSFSR, Russian Federated Socialist Federal Republic. There was a river and geologic anomaly there, and that was all. The anomaly was a mountain made of iron. The river locale made it accessible to supply of whatever was needed to develop this iron. Magnitogorsk would become the world's largest city devoted to iron and steel manufacturing, dwarfing Pittsburgh in size and extent. Joseph Stalin had climbed this mountain in his youth, and as many young people do, he had experimented with a magnetic compass while climbing, and had seen how the compass went crazy in different directions according to where one happened to be at the moment. Over the years, he consulted many geologists and engineers about the possibility of exploiting this resource, and now he put that knowledge to work. Everything for Magnetic Mountain and its A to Z steel manufacturing complex at the center of a satellite of cities devoted to large-scale industrial manufacturing plants had to be imported to the chosen site and implanted into the virgin land. During the years of its construction, that is all of the 1930s, every attempt was made to jump ahead in social organization along lines which would serve as a model for new socialist humanity. For a wonderful exposition of what Stalinist socialism could and did achieve, I recommend the book Magnetic Mountain, Stalinism as a Civilization, written by Stephen Corkin, published by University of California Press in 1995, and I found a copy of it available in its entirety on the internet, which you could access for free. Great advances were made in the development of education from kindergarten through tertiary levels of university and technical institutes. Great advances were made in training working people to discuss daily events from the class struggle perspective to determine what a socialist course and/or perspective should look like on each of the many issues arising in Soviet life. At the same time, old ideas, some of them contemporary Bolshevik ideas, were set aside in favor of publicly discussed and agreed upon modifications, as in the areas of marriage, divorce, and abortion. No area of cultural life was ignored, as the buildings comprising Magnetic Mountain were constructed to house every area of social as well as technological life. 10 years is all we have. Suffice to say, we Bolsheviks prevailed again. Collectivization gave Stalin the agricultural produce he needed to sell at home and abroad to come up with the cash to buy all the factories and machinery that the Soviet Union needed. If his program to bring the USSR to modern capitalist levels within 10 years were to succeed. I'm taking an excerpt from Stalin's speech to the Industrial Managers Conference on 4 February 1931. Quote, "We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this lag in 10 years. Either we do it or they crush us." Unquote. Now, as importantly, Stalin had eliminated the class enemy on the land. These kulaks and their hangers-on had been the backbone of Russian capitalism, and now they were gone. The countryside was socialist and unified in political lockstep conformity with the Red government in Moscow. Although overall agricultural production was reduced because of the sabotage of the kulaks, the portion the government received went way up. Originally, these fists, or kulaks, were the local bosses the Tsar and the aristocrats used to keep the common farmers in line, and they had been killed in the Civil War. After the NEP, this class was reborn among the winners in the grab bag redistribution of 1917. If the Soviet government got 10% of the previous overall private farm output, that was a lot less than the 60 to 90% of the collective farm output the Soviet government now received. For the first time since the October Revolution in 1917, the Soviet government's treasury was permanently full of reliable revenue streams and had, if anything, an excess of cash. The Soviet government was no longer dependent upon the international capitalist marketplace for income. It could determine the nature of that market. How? By making the international capitalist market depend upon it, withholding or releasing products such as grain as it desired to assure a given market price. Along with the sale of oil, timber, minerals, diamonds, furs, caviar, and other exotic products, the government had stable, reliable income from multiple profit centers. Henceforth, the Soviet government would have all the cash it required to conform to the international capitalist insistence on being paid in cash up front. Accordingly, the Soviet government, for the first time, could demand and get credit at least from merchant bankers, and the banking credit blockade had been broken. One merchant banker, Armin Hammer, describes some of his anecdotal experiences in his book Hammer, which I found very entertaining and informative to read. For Stalin, collectivization was a tremendous success. He had eliminated the class enemy on the land inside the USSR and gotten a permanent source of income in the form of agricultural goods. The capitalist farmers had been brought to heel. The new Soviet farming class held its head high for the first time. The Soviet Union was now a financial power on the world scene. And that brings us to a conclusion of this particular lecture. And we're going to go ahead and finish up our lectures on building socialism next time around.